Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you also to the entire CTLT team. Great. I would like to introduce our discussant now, Dr. Candis Callison. Candis Callison is a member of the Tahltan Nation located in northern BC. She is a faculty member of the Graduate School of Journalism here at UBC, where she teaches media ethics and science and environmental journalism. Candis holds a PhD and a Master of Science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is currently finishing her book titled How Climate Change Comes to Matter, forthcoming from Duke University Press, which is based on her doctoral research on climate change, media, and social movements in the United States. Prior to her academic work, Candis worked as a journalist here in Vancouver and later in the US. Welcome, Candis.
And thank you again to the Musqueam people and to Elder Larry Grant for having us here today. It's a really interesting group of presentations, and I love the last slide. Don't forget who you are, don't forget who we are. In light of the sort of organizing theme around I don't know more, that's probably the perfect slide to start talking about. I don't know more at its very height of action on Twitter. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but I don't know more was on Twitter a lot. And at the very height on January 11th, there was actually an audience of over 1.5 million, which is more than many nightly newscasts in Canada for sure. And myself and my colleague, Alfred Hermida at the Journalism School, have been looking a lot at the Twitter feed over that period of months from the beginning of December until the end of January, beginning of February, and really looking at what kinds of things were in circulation. Still research that's very much in process, but it really shows itself to be a conversation, and a conversation among elites and non-elites. Yes, sure, Nelly Furtado and Naomi Klein had the top tweets, but if you start looking below the top 20, you see a lot of people from all over Canada, names you've never heard of. Well, maybe DJ Indian might have. And definitely musicians played a prominent role, but you start to see a really interesting conversation. And if you paid attention to the Twitter feed at that time, you would see the amazing impulse to both educate and be in conversation. If you follow the message boards after the time when the mainstream media finally caught on to I don't know more and started reporting on it, you'd see Aboriginal people, definitely Aboriginal people on message boards after news articles, trying to have a conversation and often eventually giving up. And so as I understand, I don't know more at this point in my research on it, is a real attempt at forging a shared history, at having a public dialogue about who we are and where we've come from, and what it means to both look to the future and look to the past all at once. And so thinking about all of these presentations here, I think the real question it raises is around shared history and around public discourse, and specifically, and this was raised on the panel before too, I think, is this question of collaboration. How do we collaborate? If our goals are not shared, how do we collaborate? If we don't have shared practices, as Leonie raised, if we don't have shared practices, how do we collaborate? If we don't think Aboriginal people are in the room, how do we collaborate? How do we collaborate if we don't have shared epistemology, as the previous panel also raised? And I think that in each one of our disciplines and professional practice, we have tacit theories of collaboration, right? We have this kind of feel for how we should work together. But there's still an underlying question, when do differences matter? When does it matter that we have different epistemologies and different ways of thinking about knowledge, different ways of valuing some kinds of knowledge over others? When do those differences matter? And as I hear the presentations, I've heard several interesting terms come up, right? Literacy. In my work teaching media ethics, I teach one class on how to report on First Nations. It's always the most challenging and rewarding class that I teach. I often bring in my colleague, Duncan McHugh, to teach half of the class, because what I consider my role to be is to fill in all of the context and the structure that people are missing generally in their sense of the history of Canada, and specifically that's important for journalists, right? So you might be able to look through the court cases and have a history of how the Supreme Court has acknowledged Aboriginal title. But what you don't see and hear very often are the silences, the activism that began at the very beginning of colonial incursion into British Columbia. When you look at the way that our chiefs were active, and I love to show this picture of the celebrations in 2010 in Spence's Bridge, where my people from northwestern British Columbia came down to Spence's Bridge to acknowledge 100 years later, right? 100 years after their first declaration of title and rights, they're still acknowledging it, right? And people came from all over the province. Obviously, it was a lot easier to come in a suburban from Telegraph Creek now than it was in 1910, but our chiefs still made the trip in 1910, and they made the trip again in 2010. And to bring those kinds of silences before journalists, so that they know when they're reporting on issues related to title and rights, that there's a lot of silences and omissions in our telling of the history of title and rights in British Columbia. And so literacy is really interesting. So the Aboriginal timeline is an interesting way of addressing that, and I loved seeing the picture of Frank Gold there. It's great. The other issue that Leonie raised is unlearning, right? Unlearning and then relearning, unlearning colonial practices and then learning Indigenous methodologies. And that at the center of that is relationship, right? So working alongside without replicating colonial practices, doing no harm. These are enormous challenges to a professional practice of any kind, planning, journalism, medicine. And yet, it comes back to what the stakes are when differences matter. And I think it raises the challenge of expertise that specifically lies before academics, right, who are asked to speak about, and sometimes to speak for. It comes to the issue of implicatedness, which I think Honey raised, right? So recognizing yourself as implicated, and this is a challenge of teaching at a journalism school as well. As, yes, journalists are always blamed for everything. But there is an implicatedness, certainly, in when you are the one who gets to define, when you are the one who gets to represent in certain ways and means. And so how, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about because of teaching at a journalism school, is what the stakes are for collaboration when, in fact, you see your responsibility to the society as a whole. How do you then go about effective collaborations, or is collaboration even possible? Is there a point in which differences matter so much that you're at a point of incommensurability, where the way you see yourself in a profession, your responsibilities to democracy and to upholding a democratic society are such that it makes it difficult to collaborate. And then the last one is around shared terminologies, and I think Alden, in your talk of intercultural understanding and fluency, like capital, and reflecting back on Leonie's presentation, has been a huge challenge for I Will Know More. And let me just read you a real provocative from Rex Murphy, who you all probably know from Cross Country Checkup. But when, on January 12th, he published a column in the National Post, which was titled, "Natives Need to Tone Down the Anger." And this particular paragraph has really stuck with me and become something I've been thinking with a lot, because what he advised, the I Will Know More movement, has been is this, quote, going all radical, hitting the racial/racist buttons, and constant invocations of empty pseudo-academic framings of, quote, colonialist, settler, imperialist mentalities do nothing but burn time, waste time, energy, and alienate a large section of the public, unquote. So a total wholesale rejection of colonialism, which in this environment we use as shorthand for structure, for context, for history. It is a way of understanding our shared history, and yet for many people, who Rex Murphy claims to represent, it is an affront. It is a point of incommensurability. It is a point at which the fork in the road begins. Put a lot of things on the table, but just to close here, thinking about Nootka as a moment of complete misunderstanding. This is something I look at a lot in my own research. They're telling you to go around and you think they're telling you who they are, right? So there's understanding how to collaborate and understanding the method of collaboration, understanding it as a problem or not a problem. I think a lot of what we've been talking here, that to me is the central issue on the table.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Candis, and to all the panelists. This might have stopped working, I think. I'm just looking to my colleagues if we can maybe take about 10 minutes for questions. Would that be okay? Yeah. Maybe we'll just take a few. I think I saw a nod back there. And just to honor the time and the sharings of the panelists. So we'll take a few questions and then maybe you can continue your conversations over the Mingler and later on throughout the day. So we have a question in the back. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. And, I'd like to say to Muslim elders and Muslim people, thank you for this opportunity to be in the territories. My name is Seema. I'm a Punjabi Canadian settler, and I'm not a native to this continent, but I am married into the Canadian community. We are far away from that community, so I live in still up to territories. I work in Quantum First Nation territories. And I'm here today to say that it's interesting listening to all of you, and it's reminded to me of how much my life ping-pongs back and forth between the settler privilege that I have and the reality of the continuing colonization that is going on, that our government is doing in our names. And so I stand here admitting today, even though I fought my whole life to not say I was Canadian, I've realized in this last 5 years of doing reconciliation work that I have to embody the settler, to be honest. And so as I hear the things that you're discussing, I would like to say my pedagogy, I've always called it decolonization. I've been trying to do this reconciliation work. And on this good day, I'm a little bit concerned that they're not connecting up. So the reconciliation work is really requiring us to build, as this brother was saying, you know, this importance of having this intercultural dialogue. But my relatives, that's kind of taking us away from what I think is underlying. And as a student there, talk to, remembering who we are. We are settlers. I would say my father is the Indian who sailed west looking for Columbus. And that's a reminder of how we all got here. We did not come here in a good way. We came here looking for something that we couldn't have in our own territories. And my relatives, that is land. And that institution of private property, we're never talking about it. And I don't know how we're going to talk about decolonization until we talk about the institution of private property. And I've talked about it for 25 years with everybody. And I'm not talking about corporations. I'm talking about why we as settlers continue to buy what many of us acknowledge as stolen land. This province is unceded territories. And I wonder if we're not going to put that issue on the table, how we're going to talk about that epistemic divide. Because in my husband's people's way of life, we do not call this sacred ground land. We call it grandmother. So, and I know it's a tough discussion, but we can be as nice to each other as we want. And it is not going to change those fundamental structures. Because if you know about fighting for treaties, all private land is off the table. That's the way that our colonial privilege continues to be maintained. So when Dr. Sandercock was talking about, where is the roots of planning, for myself, I take it back to the doctrine of discovery. I go back to the 15th century and I'll talk about inter cetera, dum diversas, and all those papal bulls that told us it was okay to engage in this massive usurpation of indigenous territories for the purpose of setting up these colonial societies. And like many of the teachers here, you'll probably find every semester, we're back on page 1. There's a whole group of students who say, I didn't know. And so my relatives in 2013, I feel it's a little late in the day to keep saying I didn't know, especially in this digital age. And so we need to start talking about what are the mechanisms by which we keep on nurturing ignorance. What are the mechanisms by which we don't talk about how we stole the generosity that was offered to us in the first place? I think that's how we can come to know. And so I'd be interested in hearing the more students and academics who are having this discussion about private property, because I know it's a single thing that alienates me from any other settler. Whenever I start saying, but what about not buying a house? But what about talking about the inherent and collective rights of Indigenous peoples? I think in this unceded province, something like 1/3 of 1% of land has been set aside for Native peoples. How can we not start there to tell our students about this and work from there? Okay, with that, yes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
I'm never idle when it comes to Aboriginal issues. I want to thank you all, and I guess one of the things that I always remember about my time here as a student, whenever Aboriginal issues came up, just the how rude students were, responding and so on, and not any professor that I had ever came out and just said something like telling the students that university is a place where you closely scrutinize your deeply cherished prejudices, and I'm going to help you do that. So I think I managed to get a PhD here without ever having heard that. But the thing I want to bring up about the journalism, I've enjoyed all the presentations actually, but just to really impress upon, you know, the power of the press, and I wonder how this situation is handled, where maybe about 5 years ago, whenever anything was printed about First Nations people, they always had capital F first, capital N for nations. And then all of a sudden, you know, whenever you see anything about First Nations people now, it's just small letters. But they don't do it for the Chinese or the English or the French, you know, Japanese. So why do we allow that to go on? So again, I guess, you know, it's who has the power, but do any of your students bring up that issue? Because I was really insulted about it when they first started doing it in the papers. Thank you.
So that's a CP style issue, Canadian press. And I'm not quite sure when it switched either. It happened when I was out of the country, did grad school. Because you're right, it used to, First Nations used to be very much in vogue, and then people started to recognize the stakes of First Nations as a term. And then you began to see Aboriginal, small a. And I'm not quite sure how that happened. Likely there's some bureaucratic, institutional explanation for it.
I can speak a little bit to how this was managed at CBC. They do have like someone in charge of all the language, like an actual language policy police person, and they're not as literate in everything as you would expect them to be, considering how much is at stake. So the one issue that I actually got to see was they actually passed a policy saying they would refer to any student who had survived Indian residential school experience as a former student, and that we were not to describe them as survivors. And the only way that was changed was we literally had the Aboriginal journalists threatened to all walk out at the same time. Like that was the only thing that actually got their attention. And it was ridiculous, because the idea of what they were basically saying was, how could you use former students if this wasn't Little Flower Academy, this wasn't, you know, and this wasn't a private school, this was, you know, but you're making it sound like that. So unfortunately, with large media organizations, you have a core group of management that do manage the language, but just don't have the background, and a lot of money is spent on trying to figure out how to not train the journalists, but the management of the newsrooms, who are way far from journalism school now, and the ones who really control it, whether the assignments get told or not. So that's really it's a hard one. I mean, for our plan, so similarly with the intercultural understanding plan, if we went with CP language rules, all of the words Aboriginal would be lowercase as well. And the response from the university colleagues and all the people that we consulted with was capitalizing. We don't care that it's CP rules. We don't care that people are going to write back saying, hey, this was wrongly capitalized. And so that's what the university has gone with. So, yeah.
Thank you. It looks like we have several more questions, and I'm getting the signal from the back that we should end. And I apologize to the panel due to technological difficulties and a bit of a late start. We lost a bit of time there. But hopefully those people who have questions, please find the panelists during the mingler, and hopefully you can share those. And I just wanted to also, I think the question that I would have asked, and probably addresses some of the ones that have come up, is around how does colonization and multiculturalism, how do they speak together, building on Candis's ideas, and what you were saying as well. So that's something for us to think about. But I wanted to thank all of you for your passion and hard work in the support of teaching, learning, and curriculum that all of you do in various departments at the university. And I'm really delighted. I didn't actually know any of you, but to be able to meet you through this panel and this process. Thank you again.